You're watching the Millennial Channel.
Before the name became mythology. Supreme Team, the Paisley Park Empire. South Jamaica in the early 1980s was not just another New York neighborhood under pressure. It was a place where housing projects, street reputation, unemployment, police pressure, and the crack economy collided at the same time. Paisley Park houses became the center of one of the most infamous street organizations in Queens, not through old mafia ceremony, but through project geography, youth crews, narcotics money, and fear. Kenneth Supreme McGriff built the Supreme Team in that environment, and Gerald Prince Miller stood close to the top as his nephew and second-in-command. Federal court records describe the organization as a crack distribution RICO enterprise built around violent enforcement and retaliation. The name Supreme was not only a street nickname, it became a brand, a command, and an identity. McGriff came out of South Jamaica with 5%er influence around him, and the early Supreme Team grew from young men connected by neighborhood, belief language, family ties, and project loyalty. The court record says the gang was organized in the early 80s near Paisley Park houses by teenagers who were members of the 5%ers, with McGriff leading and Miller standing as second in command. They focused their criminal work on crack distribution at the exact moment crack was changing street economies across New York. Paisley Park gave the team a natural fortress. The buildings created a map of courtyards, rooftops, apartments, stairwells, lobbies, parking areas, and sightlines. A street crew in a project does not only control a corner, it controls who walks through, who parks, who buys, who watches, who warns, who can hide, and who can be reached fast. The Supreme Team used lookouts, armed bodyguards, coded language, and two-way radios on rooftops to protect the business and keep leaders insulated from the street level. Federal judges later described that sophistication as one reason the organization survived earlier state prosecutions before the larger federal case landed. At its peak in 1987, the Supreme Team was pulling in numbers that sounded unreal to people outside the neighborhood. Federal records said the operation's receipts exceeded $200,000 a day from street-level crack sales. The same records said the group used violence and murder to hold its control over the area's drug trade. This was not a small crew earning from one hallway. This was a project-based drug corporation with layers of sellers, managers, security, suppliers, and lieutenants working underneath a leadership circle. The structure under Supreme and Prince was designed to separate leadership from the most exposed work. Sellers worked the spots. Managers handled crews. Security protected leaders and enforced rules. Couriers moved cash and narcotics. Other trusted members processed powder cocaine into crack and delivered packages back to the retail locations. In the later Miller-era reconstruction, names such as Arroyo, Hunt, Ernesto Pinella, Hale, Jimenez, Julio Hernandez, Tucker, Coleman, David Robinson, Raymond Robinson, and Trent Morris appeared in court descriptions of the hierarchy and work division. The security wing gave the team its reputation outside simple drug sales. Ernesto Pinella was described as chief of security. Julio Hernandez was described as a security force member. Others acted as bodyguards, enforcers, and armed protectors. Court records later said violence was not treated as random street emotion, but as part of the enterprise's method of keeping territory, punishing suspected informants, intimidating rivals, and keeping members in line. That is where the Supreme Team moved from neighborhood crew into organized racketeering structure in the eyes of federal prosecutors. The first major government strike came in 1987. A joint state and federal investigation led to McGriff's arrest, and while Miller was also facing state custody, law enforcement executed search warrants against Supreme Team storage locations, drug outlets, residences, and related spots. The organization had been tipped before the raid, and court records say 11 kilograms of cocaine and $200,000 were removed from targeted premises before authorities arrived. Even with that warning, officers still seized weapons, narcotics equipment, photographs, documents, manuals, a kilogram of cocaine, and thousands of dollars. After the raid and his own arrest, McGriff ordered the team's operations shut down. That shutdown did not end the organisation. It created a pause, a leadership shift and a new phase. In 1989, McGriff pleaded guilty to engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise and received a 12-year sentence. With Supreme locked up, Gerald Prince Miller moved from second-in-command into the active leadership position. Federal records say Miller strengthened his control by expanding the security force and using it against rivals and team members suspected of disloyalty. The Department of Justice later stated that during 1987 alone, Miller and the then-incarcerated McGriff ordered at least 8 homicides. Prince Miller's version of the Supreme Team carried a different weight. Supreme had the founding name, but Prince had to prove the machine could still run without its original figure on the street. When Miller was released in spring 1989, he rebuilt the organisation and regained 2 of its most profitable retail locations, called spots in the court record. The reorganised operation ran through an apartment connected to David Robinson's mother, where money came in, cocaine deals were arranged, cocaine was converted into crack, and packages moved back out for sale. By that period, the rebuilt team had climbed back to around $10,000 a day in gross receipts, lower than the 1987 peak, but still serious enough to draw heavy attention. The rebuilt structure had names and jobs. Arroyo was described as second in command, Hunt served as Miller's bodyguard, Piniella led security, Hale, Jimenez and Julio Hernandez worked security. Tucker and Coleman managed retail spots and supervised workers. David Robinson helped supervise drug operations and kept records. Raymond Robinson arranged cocaine purchases, worked security during deals, supervised the processing of cocaine into crack, and delivered product to sales locations. That kind of structure is what separated the Supreme Team from a loose group of street sellers. The team's relationship with Lorenzo Fat Cat Nichols placed it inside a larger Queens drug landscape. Nichols led another drug organization that supplied the Supreme Team with powder cocaine. In one court-described episode, Nichols suspected Henry and Isaac Bolden of robbing his organization while he was incarcerated, then sought Miller's help in finding them. The Supreme Team used corrupt parole employees Ina McGriff and Ronnie Younger for information, false documents and other assistance. Court testimony said Miller paid $3,000 for address information connected to the Boldens and their families. The corruption around parole officers showed the team's reach beyond the projects. Ina McGriff, not related to Kenneth McGriff, supervised Supreme Team Security Chief Ernesto Piniella and became romantically involved with him. Ronnie Younger became romantically involved with Miller. The court record said both women were regularly paid for assistance, including parole information, false identification, and other help. Ina McGriff also supplied ammunition, according to the federal appeals account. The James Page murder became another marker of the organization's retaliation system. Court records said Ina McGriff gave Piniella parole documents indicating that Supreme Team member James Page was cooperating with authorities. Kenneth McGriff, already arrested on federal charges, ordered that Page be killed. Piniella then arranged the murder. In the Supreme Team world, suspected cooperation was treated as a threat against the whole business, not only a personal betrayal. The supplier murders showed the team's brutality from another angle. Court records describe Colombian suppliers Fernando Suarez and Pablo Pelaza arriving at Hale's Baisley Park apartment in August 1989. The team decided to steal their cocaine instead of buying it. Suarez and Pelaza were held, bound and killed. Then their bodies were loaded into a car and dumped in separate Queens locations. The details entered federal court as part of the larger RICO picture, showing a crew willing to turn on supply channels when greed, fear and opportunity lined up. Gus Rivera's story added another layer of internal danger. Rivera had introduced team leaders to Colombian suppliers. After supplier-related violence, the organization came to view him as a liability. Court records say Arroyo arranged for him to be killed, first through a shooting in a Baisley Park courtyard that Rivera survived, then later through a second attack after Rivera's location was learned from his girlfriend under threat. Rivera was eventually found and shot to death in a Queens motel room. By March 1990, the government had moved from watching the team to dismantling it. State authorities arrested several Supreme Team members after wiretaps and investigations, but after state pretrial rulings went against the prosecution, the state case fell apart and evidence passed to federal prosecutors. The federal indictment charged RICO, narcotics conspiracy, crack distribution counts, cocaine possession counts, continuing criminal enterprise counts, and other charges. The Miller trial later included more than 100 wiretapped conversations, telephone records, fingerprints, firearms, ammunition, narcotics equipment, documents, photographs, crime scene evidence, and roughly 80 witnesses. The witnesses told the story from inside. Former accomplices such as Ernesto Pineda, Julio Hernandez, Trent Morris, Tony McGee, and Ina Griff testified. Law enforcement witnesses described homicide scenes, searches, surveillance, and investigative work. The courtroom became the opposite of Baisley Park secrecy. Every coded call, every ledger, every bodyguard role, every movement through apartments and spots was translated for a jury. In 1993, Miller and 6 other Supreme Team members were convicted of narcotics trafficking and racketeering, and federal records later described those convictions as a major break in the original Supreme Team structure. The first Supreme Team era had 2 dominant faces, Supreme and Prince. Supreme founded the name, shaped the brand, and gave the organization its first rise. Prince held the street operation during the Reconstruction and carried the pressure of leadership after the 1987 collapse. The government treated the organization as a RICO enterprise, not just a drug crew. That distinction turned Baisley Park from a neighborhood story into a federal organized crime case. Kenneth McGriff came home in the mid-90s and entered a different world. The crack era had changed. Federal prosecution had changed, hip-hop had changed, street figures were no longer only neighborhood names. Some were appearing around music, video, independent film, and celebrity culture. McGriff tried to step into film work, including a project tied to Donald Goines-style crime fiction, and his public orbit eventually crossed into Murder Inc. Records, one of the most powerful rap labels of the early 2000s. The second McGriff organization was not simply the Supreme Team rebuilt in the same form. Federal prosecutors called it the McGriff Enterprise. According to the 2005 indictment announcement, after McGriff's release, he built a broader organization that moved from New York into Maryland and North Carolina. The indictment described wholesale trafficking involving more than 30 kilograms of heroin, 150 kilograms of cocaine, and 1.5 kilograms of cocaine base. This was a different model from the original project-based street-level crack operation. The Maryland and North Carolina corridor showed the expansion. Federal authorities cited a 2001 North Carolina traffic stop involving Victor Wright and another dealer, where officers found about 2 kilograms of cocaine in a duffel bag. They also described a Baltimore County double homicide involving Karen Claret and Dwayne Thomas, followed by a search that uncovered narcotics, a handgun, cash, and paraphernalia at a nearby stash location. Prosecutors said McGriff's fingerprints were found at that stash house. These details placed the later enterprise far beyond one Queens housing project. The Murder Inc. connection brought the story into national headlines.